Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the iPhone XS Max and see how this particular iPhone holds up in 2025. Now, the number one thing I would definitely tell you is that for one, I'm a massive fan of the iPhone XS Max. I think this is easily one of the better phones Apple has ever made. I don't think it's perfect anymore, and I don't think this was the most important phone Apple has ever made right now. But I do think back in 2018, this was kind of one of those sleeper phones, meaning this was a phone that came, we thought it was good, but there was a lot of legacy that this phone actually brought. And I will tell you, even though this phone isn't the first phone I would recommend people to buy, it still brought a lot of stuff to the table that we still think about in a lot of phones nowadays. So we'll take a look at that throughout this whole entire video. If you want to pick up this phone or some other iPhones, I would probably recommend more than this thing. Links will be down in the description below. You can get that from there and you can help support the channel at the exact same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the iPhone XS Max, this particular phone on the front side is giving you a 6.5-inch Super Retina OLED display. Now, this phone came out about 7 years ago. So it's been a while since this phone has came out. You can imagine it's been a couple of years since things came out. So this type of panel definitely is kind of showing its age. It is not the brightest panel. It definitely isn't that bright, but it's still a big size panel. You're getting the notch up top. You're getting True Tone's OLED display. So there's a lot of stuff that doesn't make me the happiest with this type of phone, but there's still a lot of stuff that I'm actually still a fan of with this device too. So I don't think it's that big of a deal. It still is like a pretty nice looking phone when it comes down to it. Now, on top of that, you're getting your lightning port at the bottom, which is still pretty good. There's not that much, kind of complain about there. On top of that, you're also basically getting a glass back on this phone, which again is a really nice thing to have. I love being able to go through and get these types of panels that are, in these phones that still feel fairly premium. But you have to remember that with this thing, it is once again kind of showing its age just a little bit because most phones now have frosted glass backs. We'll get into that in a little bit later, but you're still getting a dual camera setup on the back side. You're still getting wireless charging, still IP certification, still a lot of stuff going on with this phone when it comes down to it. But I probably would tell you when it comes down to it, it makes a lot more sense to probably get some other devices for the most part. So we'll get into that in a second. But for the most part on the exterior, still a fan of it. It still looks great. There's not really that much to complain about there. But when compared to some other devices that basically, have came out since then, you have to keep in mind this phone is missing out on a high refresh rate. So it's only 60 Hz. It is not 120 Hz. You're also basically only getting, no flat sides here, no USB Type-C port, which that in and of itself can be kind of a disadvantage for some people. You're only getting standard glass back, no frosted glass back, no reverse wired charging, no, MagSafe capability, no triple camera setup. There's a lot of stuff within this device that we're basically missing out on. I would love to be able to get a phone like this that still looks like this, but just more of the things that I mentioned. So that's kind of where we're at from that particular capability. From a price tag side, this phone is giving you a price of $220 in the used market. That right there, it actually isn't that bad of a price. You could probably imagine getting a phone like this. It really doesn't look that bad. And I do think if you are going to go through and get a device, this isn't really that bad of it's not a bad price tag. And I think that's why a lot of people would look at this type of phone and probably consider it just because it is such a cheap price from that standpoint. It'd be a lot nicer to be able to go ahead and buy a phone like this with that price tag. And when compared to something like an iPhone 16 Pro Max, there's still a lot of similarity, but there's quite a few differences. But that price tag does look very, very convincing on something like the iPhone, XS Max. Now, moving on to the camera side, this phone is giving you a dual camera setup on the back side. So it's a 12 megapixel wide and then a 12 megapixel telephoto lens. Then you're also getting a 7 megapixel standard camera on the front side. Now, here's the thing about this type of camera, right? This type of camera, I would say, still looks pretty good, right? It's still a dual camera setup, 4K at 60 on the back, 1080p at 60 on the front, and definitely being able to go through and buy a phone, once again, that looks something like this. I think that is a really, really nice thing. This type of camera is not perfect. There are definitely some issues going on with this type of camera. One, you're not getting 4K at 60 on the front. You're only getting it on the back, which still might be okay for a lot of people, but I do like getting a phone that gives me a better camera there. And on top of that, you are missing out on a few things like, there's no cinematic mode inside of this phone, which is a little bit of a disadvantage. You're missing out on some other things in this phone that a lot of other phones have nowadays too. So the camera quality itself, it is a bit grainy. It wasn't really like the biggest upgrade coming from the previous generation of devices, to be honest. But I still think like if you are going to go through and pick up a phone, this thing, it's really not that terrible of an option. But like I said, there are significantly better devices that you can get your hands on from a camera perspective than this thing. And this thing wasn't even the best type of camera back when this phone originally came out too. So from that side, that kind of covers it up there too. Now on top of that, when it comes down to the software longevity side, this device, it's basically still supported with software, which is still really, really nice to have. So being able to go through and buy a phone like this, that is still going to be giving you this type of software update, I think is a very nice, feature set. I think being able to go through and buy a phone that's still supported with software, it's massive. I love being able to go through and get devices like that. So that in and of itself, it is a very nice thing, but you are going to have to keep in mind a few things. Number one, if you are going to go through and pick up this phone, it's not going to be supported forever. And we're not really too sure how long this device is necessarily going to last. If I had to guess, I feel like this phone is still going to be giving us, maybe like another couple of years, probably like another year. Maybe it's going to get iOS 19 if we're lucky. That's kind of what the rumors suggest. But for the most part, I don't think this phone's going to be lasting that long. And that's just one thing we're going to have to kind of keep in mind here. So once again, I think it's okay, but that is just one of those things you're going to have to keep in mind at the end of the day. When it comes down to the battery life wise, this phone was actually, at that time, I think it was giving us the biggest size battery on any iPhone, a 3,174 milliamp hour battery. So that right there in and of itself, that is a pretty good size battery to have inside of this type of device. So once again, being able to go through and buy these types of devices, it is actually a really, really nice thing, right? So I will say that is more of a pro than a con. But once again, if you are going to go through and pick up a device, it is always kind of nice to be able to go through and get a device that's going to be giving you a little bit of a bigger size battery, and a majority of iPhones are now giving you that nowadays. And finally, when it comes down to the performance, this device is giving you that Apple A12 Bionic chip inside of it with 4 gigabytes of RAM. Now, from that particular side, the thing I will definitely tell you about the performance side is that this device, from the performance side, it's still decent. It's not terrible. It's not a terrible performing device. It still feels okay, right? It feels okay for a 7-year-old phone. Like if you're going to go through and pick up a 7-year-old device, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense to go and, expect that much from it. And that is exactly what's going on here. But I will still say, for the most part, if you are going to go through and pick up a device, this thing's not terrible, right? I think it actually performs better than you'd probably expect, which is kind of insane in and of itself. Now, with that being said, I do think most watches nowadays, I think most, iPhones nowadays give you a way better experience than this thing, but this thing wasn't terrible, right? And that's kind of the thing about this phone. The iPhone XS Max, it's not a terrible performing device, right? This thing still is pretty decent, and I think it is actually a pretty decent type of device when it comes down to it. I think if you're going to go through and pick up a phone though, it doesn't make any sense to buy this because it doesn't have much of a future ahead of it. I think it makes a lot more sense to go and buy iPhones like an iPhone 13 Pro, an iPhone 13 Pro Max, an iPhone 14 Pro Max. Those types of iPhones make a lot more sense to go and buy than this thing. I think this thing was fine for a while, but I really don't think it's worth buying anymore, and I'd probably recommend buying some other devices when it comes down to it. So from that side, that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that'll mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.